Talbot County, Alabama, kept a secret so disturbing that 3 generations refused to speak of it openly. Between March 1838 and September 1839, 17 people died under mysterious circumstances at Oak Ridge Plantation, and not a single death certificate listed the true cause. Local physicians burned their records. The county clerk erased entire pages from the official register. When investigators from Mobile finally arrived in October 1839, they found a community united in silence, protecting something far worse than any crime they could imagine. What they discovered in a sealed root cellar beneath the main house would challenge everything the antebellum South claimed about civilization, medicine, and the lengths one woman would go to protect a lie that could destroy an entire family legacy. Before we continue with the story of Amelia Hargrove and the ritual that consumed Oak Ridge Plantation, we invite you to subscribe to Forgotten Liturgy and leave a comment telling us which state or city you are listening from. Your support helps us bring more forgotten American mysteries to light. The truth began with a death that nobody questioned, because wealthy men dying suddenly in Alabama was common enough in 1838. Talbot County stretched across the fertile Chattahoochee River Valley, where cotton grew so thick that plantation owners measured their wealth not in dollars, but in bales per acre. By 1838, the county had become one of Alabama's wealthiest regions, with over 60 major plantations producing cotton that fed the mills of Manchester and Liverpool. The town of Milford served as the county seat, a prosperous community of 3,000 souls where Episcopal churches stood on every corner and social hierarchy was as rigid as iron. Oak Ridge Plantation occupied 1,400 acres of prime bottomland along Beaver Creek, about 7 miles southeast of Milford. The main house rose 3 stories high, built in the Federal style, with columns that gleamed white against red brick. 42 enslaved people worked the cotton fields, while another 18 served in the house, stables, and workshops. The plantation had belonged to the Sinclair family since 1792, passed down through 3 generations of prosperous planters who prided themselves on their English ancestry and refined manners. Amelia Hargrove Sinclair arrived at Oak Ridge in 1820 as a bride of 19, married to Edward Sinclair, then 34, and already a widower. She came from Charleston, daughter of a shipping merchant whose fortunes had declined after the embargo years. The marriage was strategic on both sides. Edward needed a wife to manage his household and provide heirs, while Amelia's family needed the security of plantation wealth. She was tall for a woman of her time, standing 5'8", with dark auburn hair and pale gray eyes that servants whispered could see through walls. Over 18 years of marriage, Amelia bore Edward 5 children: Eliza in 1821, William in 1823, Sophia in 1825, Henry in 1828, and finally Charlotte in 1831. The Sinclair family occupied a position of considerable influence in Talbot County society. Edward served as a county commissioner and owned shares in the Milford Bank. Amelia hosted elaborate dinner parties and was known for her French cooking and precisely managed household. Neighbors considered her cold but capable, a woman who ran Oak Ridge with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. But those who knew her best noticed something else. Amelia kept extensive journals, writing by candlelight long after the household slept. She ordered medical texts from Philadelphia and Charleston, unusual for a plantation wife whose education should have focused on household management and music. The plantation's enslaved community whispered about the mistress who walked the fields at dawn, examining workers with the intensity of a livestock appraiser, asking strange questions about their family histories and physical constitutions. Edward Sinclair appeared to be a typical planter of his era, stern but not exceptionally cruel, focused on profit margins and maintaining social standing.
He drank whiskey most evenings, smoked cigars on the veranda, and discussed politics with visiting neighbors. He attended the Presbyterian Church in Milford every Sunday, occupying the Sinclair family pew with his wife and children, arranged in order of age. Yet there were irregularities that few outside the family knew about. Edward kept a separate bedroom from Amelia after 1832, claiming her nighttime writing disturbed his sleep. He had suffered from recurring digestive complaints for several years, treated by Dr. Elias Thornton from Milford with calomel and laudanum. The complaints worsened through 1837, though Dr. Thornton found nothing particularly alarming in his examinations. The enslaved population at Oak Ridge included 3 men who held unusual positions in the plantation hierarchy. Elijah Hawthorne, age 32, worked as the head carpenter and was responsible for maintaining all structures on the property. His father had been a skilled craftsman from Virginia, and Elijah inherited both the talent and the privileged position that came with essential skills. He was literate, having been taught to read by Edward's father in the 18-teens, so he could follow building plans and order supplies. Jonas Blackwood, 28, served as the plantation's blacksmith and metalworker. He had been purchased from a failed plantation in South Carolina in 1829, specifically for his smithing skills. Jonas was powerfully built, standing over 6 feet tall, and was known for his quiet intensity and complete focus on his work. Unlike most enslaved workers, he lived in a separate cabin near the forge, rather than in the quarters with the field hands. The third man was Levi Stanton, 26, who worked as Edward Sinclair's personal body servant, and occasionally as a driver, supervising field work. Levi had grown up at Oak Ridge, born to a house servant named Ruth, who had died of consumption in 1824. Edward had taken an unusual interest in the boy's education, having him trained in various skills, including reading, arithmetic, and the management of other workers. All 3 men shared certain physical characteristics. They were tall, well-built, lighter-skinned than most of the plantation's enslaved population, and possessed skills that elevated them above field labor. All 3 had been granted small privileges, such as keeping a portion of money earned from hiring out their skills to neighboring plantations. And all 3 bore the same peculiar birthmark, a crescent-shaped discoloration on their left shoulder blade, though this detail would not become significant until much later. Life at Oak Ridge followed the rhythms common to cotton plantations in Alabama lowlands. Spring planting began in March. The cotton bolls opened in September, and harvest consumed October and November. The enslaved population arose before dawn and worked until darkness, with brief breaks for meals. Amelia managed the household staff with exacting precision, maintaining inventories of every sheet, spoon, and candle. She personally supervised the kitchen, the dairy, the smokehouse, and the weaving house, where cloth was produced for the plantation's use. Edward spent his days riding the fields, meeting with his overseer, and handling the business correspondence that connected Oak Ridge to cotton factors in Mobile. He traveled to Milford twice a week for business meetings and social engagements. In the evenings, the family gathered for supper in the formal dining room, where Amelia enforced strict rules about conversation, posture, and etiquette. But beneath this surface of plantation normalcy, something else was growing. Amelia's journals from 1836 and 1837, later discovered and partially destroyed, contained increasingly strange observations about bloodlines, inheritance, and what she called the persistence of traits across generations. She had been corresponding with someone in Charleston, letters that arrived in plain envelopes without return addresses. She had also been purchasing unusual medical supplies through a connection in Montgomery, including mercury compounds, arsenic preparations, and equipment for what she described in her accounts as hydrotherapeutic treatments. The winter of 1837 to 1838 was particularly harsh in Talbot County. Temperatures dropped below freezing for days at a stretch, unusual for the Alabama lowlands. The Chattahoochee River froze at its edges. Enslaved people huddled in their cabins, burning whatever fuel they could gather. In the main house, fireplaces roared constantly, and the family wore layers of wool even indoors. Edward's health declined sharply that winter. His digestive complaints became severe cramping. He lost weight rapidly, his face taking on a gray, waxy appearance. Dr. Thornton visited weekly, prescribing various remedies that seemed to provide no relief. Amelia personally prepared all of Edward's meals, bringing trays to his bedroom and feeding him broths and tonics of her own making. On the morning of March 3, 1838, Edward Sinclair was found dead in his bed by Levi Stanton, who had arrived to help the master dress for the day. Edward was 52 years old. Dr. Thornton, summoned immediately, examined the body and declared the cause of death to be acute gastric fever with complications of the liver. He noted that Edward had been declining for months, and that such deaths were regrettably common among men of his age and habits. Amelia received the news with remarkable composure. She did not weep or cry out. Instead, she immediately began organizing the funeral arrangements with methodical precision. She selected Edward's burial clothes, drafted the death notice for the Milford newspaper, and sent word to relatives in Charleston and Mobile.
He ordered the plantation's enslaved workers to drape the main house in black crepe and prepare the parlor for the view. Edward Sinclair was buried 3 days later in the family cemetery at Oak Ridge, a small plot surrounded by an iron fence where his parents and his first wife already rest. The funeral was attended by most of Talbot County's prominent families. Reverend Jeremiah Stokes from the Presbyterian Church delivered a sermon about earthly rewards and heavenly rest. Amelia stood at graveside, dressed entirely in black silk, her face hidden behind a heavy veil, her gloved hands folded calmly at her waist. What no one knew was that the morning after Edward's death, before the body was even cold, Amelia had gone to the root cellar beneath the kitchen house. There she retrieved a locked wooden box she had hidden among the stored vegetables. Inside were letters, medical receipts, and a small journal bound in black leather. She spent an hour reading through these documents by lamplight, her face expressionless. Then she returned them to the box and hid it in a new location, beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom closet. The day after the funeral, Amelia summoned Elijah Hawthorne, Jonas Blackwood, and Levi Stanton to the main house. She met them in Edward's former study, sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. She told them that they would be taking on new duties that would require absolute discretion and obedience. She explained that she had been instructed by a European physician specialist in a new medical treatment that would preserve her health and allow her to continue managing the plantation effectively. The treatment required assistance, and they had been selected for this purpose. None of the three men had any choice in the matter. Amelia owned them as completely as she owned the furniture in the room. They listened as she described what would be expected of them, and though the instructions were strange and disturbing, they understood that refusal was impossible. Amelia's gray eyes remained fixed on each man as she spoke, and there was something in that gaze that seemed to suggest far more than simple authority. There was knowledge, dark and specific, that seemed to pin each man in place. The ritual would begin the following morning at Beaver Creek. Beaver Creek wound through the southern portion of Oak Ridge Plantation, a clear stream about 20 feet wide that flowed year-round, even in drought. The creek was spring-fed, and its water remained cold even in summer. Cypress trees grew along its banks, their roots creating natural seats and steps down to the water. The enslaved population used the creek for washing clothes on designated days, but generally it remained quiet and isolated, hidden from the main house by a grove of live oaks and thick undergrowth. On the morning of March 7th, 1838, 4 days after Edward Sinclair's funeral, Amelia walked to Beaver Creek at first light. She wore a simple gray dress with none of the mourning finery she displayed publicly, and she carried a bundle wrapped in linen. She was followed at a distance by Elijah, Jonas, and Levi, who had been instructed to arrive separately so as not to draw attention. The morning was cold and damp, with fog rising from the creek surface. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. Birds called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance a hound barked at the plantation house. The world was just waking up, and in that liminal hour between night and day, the creek seemed to exist outside of normal time. Amelia stopped at a particular bend in the creek where a large flat rock jutted into the water, creating a natural platform. She set down her bundle and turned to face the 3 men who stood uncertainly on the bank. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and matter-of-fact, as though she were giving instructions for building a fence or slaughtering a hog. She explained that they would all enter the water together. She would remove her clothing, and they would do the same. They would stand in a circle in the waist-deep water, and she would perform certain ablutions on each of them and on herself. They would remain silent throughout the process.
They would tell no one about these sessions, which would occur every morning at dawn. Any man who spoke of what happened at the creek would be sold immediately to the worst slave trader she could find, sent to the sugar plantations in Louisiana, where men died within 5 years. But beyond the threat, there was something else in her voice. A certainty, a knowing. She looked at each man and said their names in a particular way, a way that suggested she knew things about them that no one else knew, things about their fathers, things about their blood. Elijah was the first to step into the water, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the far bank. Jonas followed, his massive shoulders rigid with tension. Levi came last, and those who later heard his account said he looked like a man walking to his own hanging. Amelia removed her dress without hesitation or modesty. She wore nothing beneath it. Her body was pale in the early morning light, marked with the faint stretch marks of 5 pregnancies. She stepped into the cold water without flinching, moving to the center where the current ran strongest. She instructed the 3 men to form a triangle around her, facing outward. What happened next would be described years later in testimony that some claimed was exaggerated by trauma and others insisted was precise truth. Amelia produced from her bundle a collection of items: a razor, several glass bottles containing clear liquids, pieces of cloth, and a small leather-bound book. She opened the book and read aloud in a language none of the men recognized, something that sounded like Latin but wasn't quite. She then proceeded to wash each man with water drawn from the creek in a specific pattern: shoulders, chest, arms, back, and legs. She used one of the liquids from her bottles, which burned slightly on the skin and smelled of chemicals and herbs. She recited phrases as she worked, her voice steady and rhythmic. The men stood rigid, staring at the trees, the sky, anywhere but at her or at each other. When she finished with the 3 men, she performed the same washing ritual on herself, her movements precise and methodical. Then she produced the razor and made small cuts on each man's left shoulder, directly over the crescent-shaped birthmarks. The cuts were shallow but deliberate, and she collected the blood that welled up on pieces of white cloth. She mixed this blood with more liquid from her bottles, and then applied the mixture to her own chest and abdomen, rubbing it into her skin while continuing to recite from the book. The entire process took perhaps 30 minutes. When it was finished, Emilia instructed the men to dress and return to their normal duties. She told them to come back tomorrow at the same time. She dressed herself, wrapped her items back in the linen bundle, and walked back toward the main house without looking back. Elijah, Jonas, and Levi stood on the creek bank for several minutes after she left, unable to speak or even look at each other. Finally, without a word, they went their separate ways to begin the day's work. But something had changed. Each man felt it, a heaviness in his chest, a confusion in his thoughts. It was as though something had been taken from them and something else left in its place. The ritual was repeated the following morning, and the morning after that, and every morning thereafter. Sometimes Emilia varied the procedure slightly, using different liquids, cutting in different places, reciting different passages from her book, but the essential elements remained the same. The dawn hour, the cold water, the nakedness, the washing, the blood, and the words. Within 2 weeks, people at Oak Ridge began to notice changes in Elijah, Jonas, and Levi. The 3 men who had previously been among the most capable and alert workers on the plantation began to move as though in a fog.
They performed their tasks adequately, but without the initiative or skill that had distinguished them. Their eyes took on a distant glaze quality. They spoke little, even to each other, communicating in brief, flat sentences when necessary. Rachel, one of the house servants who had known Levi since childhood, later testified that it was like watching a man slowly disappear from inside his own body. He still looked like Levi, still walked and talked like him, but the essential spark that made him who he was seemed to be draining away day by day. She tried asking him what was wrong, but he just stared at her as though he didn't quite recognize, then turned and walked away without answering. The other enslaved people noticed too. Whispers began in the quarters at night. The 3 men were being worked with roots, conjured, hexed. Mistress Emilia had learned dark magic from somewhere, perhaps from New Orleans, where such things were known. The men were being poisoned slowly, their minds stolen, but no one dared speak openly about it, and certainly no one dared confront Emilia herself. In the main house, Emilia's children noticed her mother's strange new routine. She rose before dawn every day, regardless of weather, and was gone for about an hour. When she returned, her hair was often damp, and she would go immediately to her room to change clothes. When young Henry, then 10 years old, asked where she went, she told him she was taking morning constitution for her health, walking by the creek. She advised him not to follow her, as the early morning air was dangerous for children with weak constitution. Eliza, the eldest daughter at 17, was more suspicious. She had always been perceptive, and she noticed not only her mother's absence, but also the changes in Elijah, Jonas, and Levi. She noticed that her mother kept the black leather book with her at all times now, even sleeping with it under her pillow. She noticed that her mother had lost weight despite eating normally, and that there was a feverish energy about her, a brightness in her eyes that seemed unnatural. One morning in early April, Eliza tried to follow her mother to the creek. She dressed quietly and slipped out of the house just as Emilia disappeared into the oak grove. But Emilia seemed to have anticipated. She was waiting just inside the tree line, her face cold with fury. She grabbed Eliza's wrist hard enough to leave bruises and told her daughter in a voice barely above a whisper that if she ever followed again, if she ever spoke to anyone about her mother's morning walks, Emilia would see to it that Eliza never married, never left Oak Ridge, never had anything approaching a life of her own. Eliza, frightened by the intensity in her mother's eye, fled back to the house. That night, Eliza wrote in her own diary, a leather journal she kept hidden in her wardrobe. She wrote that her mother had become something she no longer recognized, that there was a wrongness emanating from her, like a smell,
that whatever was happening at the creek was evil, though Eliza had no clear understanding of what evil meant beyond what she had learned in church. She wondered if she should tell someone, but who? Her father was Reverend Stokes. What would she even say? Eliza decided to watch and wait. She began observing her mother more carefully, noting small detail, the chemical smell that sometimes clung to Amelia's clothes, the way she would stare at Elijah, Jonas, and Levi during the day, studying them like specimens. The locked box that appeared in her mother's room, a box that hadn't been there before her father's death. Meanwhile, the spring planting season had begun in earnest. The fields required constant attention. Amelia supervised the work with her usual efficiency, meeting with the overseer, checking the accounts, ensuring that every task was completed properly. To the outside world, she was exactly what a plantation widow should be: capable, composed, managing her late husband's estate until her eldest son came of age to take over. But at night, alone in her room, Amelia wrote in her journals by candlelight. She recorded observations about the three men's deteriorating condition. She noted changes in their vital, their responsiveness, their physical capability. She wrote about dosages and frequencies.
She referenced passages from medical texts and correspondence with someone she referred to only as Dr. H. She wrote about her own physical sensations, changes she believed were occurring in her body, improvements in her health that she attributed to the treatments. And she wrote about her late husband, Edward. Though these entries were cryptic and bitter, she wrote about lies and discoveries and betrayals. She wrote about bloodlines and inheritances. She wrote about the need to correct what had been corrupted, to purify what had been tainted. Her handwriting in these passages became increasingly erratic, the letters slashing across the page with violent energy. If this disturbing ritual was giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the nightmare that consumed Oak Ridge Plantation. By May 1838, the changes in Elijah, Jonas, and Levi had become impossible to ignore. All three men had lost significant weight. Their movements had become slow and uncoordinated. Elijah, who had been capable of building complex structures from memory, now needed written instructions for even simple repairs. Jonas's metalwork became sloppy and imprecise. Levi could barely remember instructions given to him an hour earlier. Dr. Elias Thornton noticed the deterioration when he visited Oak Ridge in late May to check on the family's health. The doctor was 63 years old, a graduate of the Medical College of Georgia in Augusta, and had been practicing in Talbot County for over 30 years. He was a small, neat man with precise movements and a reputation for thoroughness, though his medical knowledge was limited to what had been taught in the 1790s and what he had learned through decades of trial and error. Amelia had invited Dr. Thornton to examine young Charlotte, who had developed a persistent cough. While treating the child, the doctor happened to see Levi Stanton carrying firewood to the house. He was struck by the gaunt appearance of the man, trembling hands. Later, while leaving, he encountered Elijah attempting to repair a shutter and noticed the same disturbing symptoms: weight loss, tremors, and a peculiar, vacant expression. Dr. Thornton mentioned his observations to Amelia, asking if there had been illness among the workers. Amelia explained that the three men had been suffering from a recurring ague common in the lowlands, something she had been treating with quinine and calomel. The doctor accepted this explanation as malaria was indeed endemic to the region and often caused such symptoms. He offered to examine the men more closely, but Amelia declined, saying she had the situation well in hand. However, Dr. Thornton was troubled enough to mention what he had seen to his colleague, Dr. Harlan Whitaker, during a meeting of the Talbot County Medical Society in Milford later that week. The two physicians discussed the symptoms over brandy, trying to determine if there was some new fever spreading through the enslaved population. Dr. Whitaker suggested that perhaps the men had been exposed to contaminated water or spoiled food. Dr. Thornton agreed this was possible, but noted that no other workers at Oak Ridge seemed affected. The conversation would have ended there, forgotten among the countless medical discussions that occupied physicians' time. Except for one detail, Dr. Thornton mentioned that Mistress Sinclair had claimed to be treating the men with quinine and calomel, but he had not observed the characteristic blue-gray discoloration of the gums and tongue that calomel typically used when used regularly. This discrepancy lodged in his mind like a splinter. In early June, something happened that brought the situation at Oak Ridge to wider attention. Elijah Hawthorne collapsed while working on repairs to the plantation's cotton gin. He simply fell forward, unconscious, and could not be revived for several minutes. When he came to, he could not remember where he was or what he was doing. His speech was slurred, and one side of his face seemed to droop slightly.
The overseer, a man named Elias Moreau, reported the incident to Amelia. She visited Elijah and the carpenters where he had been taken to rest. She examined him briefly, then ordered that he be kept in his cabin and given only water and bread until he recovered. She said the man had been drinking, though Elias knew for certain that Elijah never touched alcohol, and there was no whiskey smell about him. 2 days later, Jonas Blackwood suffered a similar collapse at the ford. He had been working iron when his legs simply gave out beneath him. Other workers found him lying on the ground, semi-conscious, muttering incoherently. Like Elijah, he recovered slowly and could not explain what had happened. Amelia's response was the same: isolation and minimal food. The enslaved community was now deeply frightened. 2 of their strongest men who had never been sick a day in their lives, were wasting away before their eyes. The whispers became more insistent. Mistress Amelia was killing them slowly. She was feeding them poison or working roots on them. Some remembered old stories from Africa and the Caribbean about people who could steal souls, who could turn strong men into hollow shells. An elderly woman named Lula, who had been brought from the Congo decades earlier and was respected for her knowledge of herbs and healing, approached Levi Stanton one evening in mid-June. She begged him to tell her what was being done to him and the others. Levi stared at her with those empty eyes and said nothing. Lula tried pressing a protective charm into his hand, a small bag of roots and stone, but Levi let it fall to the ground and walked away. Lula went to the overseer, Elias Moreau, a rare step for an enslaved person to take, as it risked severe punishment. She told him that the mistress was doing something evil to the 3 men, that she was draining their life force at the creek every morning. Elias dismissed her claims as superstitious nonsense and threatened to have her whipped if she spread such wild stories. But privately, Elias was beginning to have his own doubts about what was happening at Oak Ridge. Elias Moreau was 35 years old, born in Louisiana to French-speaking parents, and had worked as an overseer on various plantations throughout Alabama and South Carolina. He was not a kind man. His profession did not allow for kindness, but he was observant and practical. He knew that plantations operated on routine and order, and what was happening at Oak Ridge was disruptive to both. He had noticed Amelia's dawn absences. He had noticed the 3 men's deterioration. He had also noticed that the mistress seemed to be thriving in a way that was unusual for a recent widow. She had more energy, seemed younger somehow, moved with a vitality that contradicted her 43 years. It was as though whatever was draining from the 3 men was flowing into her. Elias began making his own observations. He started rising early, positioning himself where he could see the path to Beaver Creek. He watched Amelia walk that path each morning, followed separately by Elijah, Jonas, and Levi.
He never went close enough to see what actually happened at the creek. Something instinctive told him that would be dangerous. But he noted the timing, the frequency, the absolute regularity of the ritual. He also began searching for information about Amelia's background. He spoke casually with the house servant, asking about the mistress's habits, her interests, her correspondence. He learned that she received letters from Charleston regularly, letters that arrived in unmarked envelopes. He learned that she had been purchasing unusual supplies from Montgomery through a connection at an apothecary shop. He learned that before her marriage to Edward Sinclair, Amelia had spent 2 years at a girls' academy in Philadelphia, unusual for a Southern woman of her generation.
By late June, Elias had accumulated enough concerning details that he considered going to the county authorities. But what exactly would he report? That a plantation mistress was taking morning walks with 3 of her slaves? That those slaves had developed mysterious health problems? That the enslaved community believed in root work? None of this amounted to any crime that the authority'd care about. Enslaved people died of fevers and mysterious ailments all the time. As long as the plantation remained productive and no white people were threatened, the law had no interest in what happened to black women. What Elias did not know was that someone else was also investigating Amelia's activities. Someone with far more resources and far more dangerous intention. In Charleston, a man named Theodore Langford had been waiting for over a year to hear from Amelia Hargrove. Langford was 52 years old, a physician who had been stripped of his medical license in Pennsylvania in 1829 after being accused of conducting unauthorized experiments on patients at the Philadelphia Hospital for the Insane. He had fled to Charleston, where he established himself as a medical consultant, serving wealthy clients interested in alternative treatments and unconventional therapy. Langford specialized in what he called vital transfusion therapy, based loosely on theories of animal magnetism and life force that had been popular in Europe in the late 1700s. His treatments involved complex rituals, combining bloodletting, hydrotherapy, chemical preparations, and psychological manipulation. He claimed he could transfer youth, health, and vitality from one person to another, that he had discovered the secret of rejuvenation that alchemists had sought for centuries. Most of his clients were desperate people with money, men facing death from wasting disease, women terrified of aging, individuals seeking any miracle that medicine could not provide. Langford charged exorbitant fees and produced elaborate documentation of his successes, though anyone investigating closely would find that most of his patients either died or disappeared shortly after treatment. Amelia had first encountered Langford in 1836 during a trip to Charleston to visit her family. She had attended a private lecture he gave at a salon hosted by one of Charleston's intellectually curious, wealthy widows. Langford spoke about the latest European theories of vital force and the possibility of controlling aging and disease through proper manipulation of the body's inherent energy. Amelia, who had been quietly studying medical texts for years, was fascinated. She arranged a private consultation with Langford at his offices on Church Street. There, in a room lined with anatomical drawings and jars of preserved specimens, she told him something she had never told anyone else. She believed her husband had been systematically deceiving her about the paternity of her children. The story Amelia revealed to Langford was complex and dark. She explained that she had discovered, through careful observation and years of suspicion, that at least 3 of her 5 children might not be Edward's biological offspring. She believed Edward had been sterile or near sterile, the result of a venereal disease he had contracted in his youth.
Rather than admit this shameful secret, Edward had arranged for other men to impregnate Amelia without her knowledge or consent. Amelia claimed that Edward had been drugging her periodically during their marriage, using laudanum and other substances to make her compliant and confused. During these episodes, other men had been brought to her bed. She believed Edward had selected enslaved men from the plantation, men who resembled him enough that any children produced would be assumed to be his. This would allow Edward to maintain the fiction of his virility and ensure the Sinclair line continued.
She had no definite proof, Amelia admitted, but the evidence was persuasive. Her first child, Eliza, looked nothing like Edward and bore a striking resemblance to certain physical features she had observed in the enslaved population at Oak Ridge. Her second son, William, was darker complexioned than either parent, with hair texture that suggested mixed ancestry. She had noticed the same crescent-shaped birthmark on 3 of her children that she later observed on Elijah, Jonas, and Levi, 3 men who had all been born at Oak Ridge in the years just before her own children. Whether Amelia's theory was true or a delusion born of years of unhappy marriage and isolation is impossible to determine with certainty, but she believed it absolutely, and that belief had transformed into an obsession that consumed her completely. She told Langford that she wanted revenge. She wanted to destroy the men who had been used to humiliate her, to violate her without her knowledge or consent. But more than revenge, she wanted something else. She wanted to reclaim what had been stolen. She wanted to take back her youth, her vitality, her power. She wanted to reverse the damage that years of childbearing and betrayal had inflicted on her body and mind. Langford listened to all of this with the calm attention of a man who had heard many desperate confessions. He told Amelia that what she wanted was possible, that his treatments could accomplish exactly what she desired. But the process would be difficult, lengthy, and required absolute secrecy and commitment. He could not come to Oak Ridge to supervise the treatments himself. His presence would draw too much attention. Instead, he would provide detailed written instruction, the necessary chemical preparations, and ongoing guidance through correspondence. The cost would be substantial, $5,000 paid in installments, plus the cost of supply. Amelia agreed immediately. She had her own money, inherited from her father, and carefully managed over the years of her marriage. She would pay whatever Langford asked. Over the next year, 1836 to 1837, Amelia received a series of letters from Langford outlining his treatment protocol. The instructions were elaborate and specific. She was to select 3 male subjects who matched certain physical criteria and who represented the men she believed had violated her. She was to begin preparing them through gradual introduction of certain chemical compounds mixed into their food, compounds that would make them suggestible and compliant. Once Edward died, Amelia could begin the full treatment protocol, which involved daily ritual bathing, bloodletting, application of various tinctures and preparations, and recitation of specific verbal formulas that Langford claimed would facilitate the transfer of vital energy from the subjects to herself. The formulas Langford provided were a mixture of legitimate medical terminology and complete fabrication. He borrowed from Franz Mesmer's theories of animal magnetism, Samuel Hahnemann's homeopathic principles, and various European occult traditions, blending them into something that sounded scientific but was essentially theatrical poison. The chemical preparations he sent included mercury compounds, arsenic solutions, digitalis extracts, and various alkaloids derived from plants. These substances, administered in carefully calibrated doses, would gradually destroy the subject's nervous systems while creating the illusion of vital force being drained away. The psychological component was equally important. Langford instructed Amelia to maintain absolute dominance over the subjects, to create an atmosphere of inevitability and helplessness. The nakedness, the cold water, the bloodletting, the incomprehensible verbal formulas, all were designed to break down the subject's sense of self and resistance. The regular dosing with chemicals would do the rest, gradually destroying cognitive function, while Amelia convinced herself that she was absorbing their youth and vitality. But Langford had another purpose beyond simply providing Amelia with her desired revenge. He was documenting everything she reported back to him, compiling data for a monograph he planned to write about vital transfusion therapy. Amelia's case was perfect. She had access to subjects who could not refuse or report the experiment. She had the intelligence and education to follow complex protocol, and she was motivated by a fanatical belief that made her the ideal collaborator. He had no moral qualms about what he was asking her to do. To Langford, enslaved people were simply convenient experimental subjects, no different from the asylum patients he had used in Philadelphia. There was, however, one element of the arrangement that Langford had not revealed to Amelia. He had been corresponding with another party, someone else in Talbot County, who had their own interest in what was happening at Oak Ridge Plantation. This third party was paying Langford a substantial additional fee for regular reports on Amelia's activities and state of mind. And this same party was preparing to use the information for purposes that would destroy Amelia completely. July 1838 brought oppressive heat to Talbot County. Temperatures climbed above 90 degrees by mid-morning and stayed there until sunset. The air hung thick and still, heavy with moisture from the Chattahoochee River. In the cotton fields, enslaved workers moved slowly through the rows, tending plants that grew lush and green in the wet heat. In the main house at Oak Ridge, the family retreated to the coolest rooms and tried to sleep through the worst of the afternoon heat. Amelia continued her dawn rituals without interruption despite the weather. If anything, she became more intense in her application of Langford's protocol. She increased the dosages of chemicals she administered to Elijah, Jonas, and Levi. She extended the duration of the creek sessions, sometimes keeping the men in the water for over an hour. She added new elements to the ritual: forced ingestion of bitter tinctures, application of caustic substances to their skin, collection of other bodily fluids beyond blood. The three men were dying. Anyone with eyes could see it. Their skin had taken on a yellow, waxy appearance. They moved like ghosts, barely present in their own bodies. Elijah could no longer work at all and spent his days sitting motionless in his cabin. Jonas collapsed twice more at the forge before Amelia ordered him confined to quarters. Levi alone continued to function at some minimal level, moving through his duties like an automaton, his eyes completely empty. But the overseer, Elias Moreau, had finally found the evidence he needed to act. In mid-July, while Amelia was occupied with visitors from Milford, Elias entered her bedroom and searched through her belongings. He found the locked box hidden beneath the floorboard in her closet. Using a pry bar, he forced it open. Inside were Langford's letters, dozens of them, outlining the entire treatment protocol in explicit detail. There were also Amelia's own journals, describing each session at the creek with clinical precision. There were receipts for chemical purchases from Montgomery. And, most damning, there was a letter Amelia had begun but never finished, addressed to Langford, in which she expressed doubt about whether the treatments were actually working or whether she was simply murdering three innocent men to satisfy her own madness. Elias took several of the most incriminating letters in one of the journals. He replaced the box carefully and left the room exactly as he'd found it. Then he rode immediately to Milford to consult with an attorney named Lawrence Caldwell, a man he knew to be both discreet and ambitious.
Caldwell read through the documents Elias had brought with growing astonishment. What Elias had uncovered was not just evidence of cruelty to enslaved workers, which no court would seriously prosecute, but something far more valuable: evidence that Amelia Hargrove was mentally unfit to manage her late husband's estate. The letters and journals revealed a woman in the grip of delusion, paranoia, and possibly homicidal mania. If properly presented, this evidence could be used to have Amelia declared legally incompetent, which would necessitate the appointment of a guardian to manage Oak Ridge and its assets.
Caldwell explained to Elias that several prominent men in Talbot County had been waiting for an opportunity to seize control of Oak Ridge. Edward Sinclair's death had left the plantation temporarily in Amelia's hands, but the property was extremely valuable, and there were parties who believed they had legitimate claims to it. With evidence of Amelia's insanity, these men could petition the court to remove her from control and install a guardian of their choosing. But Caldwell advised caution. They needed to build a stronger case, gather more witnesses, and time their move carefully. If they acted too quickly, Amelia might destroy evidence or flee with her children to Charleston. They needed to let the situation develop a little longer. Let Amelia's behavior become even more indefensible, then strike decisively. Elias agreed to wait, though he insisted something must be done about the 3 dying men. Caldwell promised to arrange for Dr. Thornton to make an official examination, which would create documentation of their condition. This documentation would be crucial for the legal case. What neither Elias nor Caldwell knew was that Amelia had already discovered the break-in. She had noticed immediately upon returning to her room that the floorboard was slightly displaced. A single scratch on the wood, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look, told her that someone had pried up the board. She checked the box and could tell from the arrangement of the letters inside that they had been disturbed. She knew immediately that it was Elias. No one else would have had the courage or the reason. The overseer had been watching her too closely, asking too many questions. She had made a mistake, trusting that her position as plantation mistress would protect her from scrutiny. She had forgotten that white men's loyalty to each other superseded any obligation to women, even wealthy white. Amelia's response was swift and ruthless. That same evening, she summoned Elias to the house and dismissed him from his position, effective immediately. She paid him the wages owed and told him to leave Oak Ridge before sunrise. Elias tried to argue, but Amelia's cold fury silenced him. She told him that if he attempted to spread lies about her, if he tried to use stolen documents against her, she would use her family's connections in Charleston to destroy him completely. She would ensure he never worked as an overseer again, anywhere in Alabama or South Carolina. Elias left Oak Ridge that night, but he took with him the letters and journal he had hidden in his saddlebags. He went directly to Lawrence Caldwell's office in Milford, and the 2 men began preparing their case in earnest. The dismissal of Elias Morrow created an immediate crisis at Oak Ridge. Amelia needed to find a new overseer quickly, as the plantation could not function without someone managing the day-to-day operations of the enslaved workforce. She promoted a man named Samuel Gentry, who had been working as a driver, to temporary overseer. Gentry was competent, but lacked Elias's experience and authority. The enslaved population sensed the instability and began to test boundaries, working more slowly, pretending not to hear orders, engaging in small acts of resistance. Amelia responded by increasing punishments and tightening control. She authorized more frequent whippings for minor infractions. She reduced rations. She imposed a strict curfew and forbade any gatherings after dark. The atmosphere at Oak Ridge became oppressive and fearful, a pressure cooker of resentment and terror. Meanwhile, her dawn rituals at Beaver Creek continued without interruption. Elijah Hawthorne died on July 28, 1838. He simply stopped breathing during the night, his body finally giving up after months of chemical poisoning abuse. Amelia ordered him buried quickly in the enslaved cemetery at the edge of the property, with no ceremony or mourning allowed. She recorded his death in the plantation ledger as fever and consumption, and immediately intensified her treatments of the remaining 2 men, as though Elijah's death had somehow strengthened rather than discouraged her obsession. In early August, Eliza Sinclair made a desperate decision. She could no longer remain silent while her mother descended into madness and murder. She wrote a letter to her maternal aunt in Charleston, Beatrice Hargrove, describing in careful detail what she had observed at Oak Ridge, her mother's strange behavior, the dawn absences, the deterioration of the 3 enslaved men, Elijah's recent death, and the pervasive sense that something evil had taken hold of the plantation. Eliza mailed the letter secretly through a trusted house servant who was sent to Milford on an errand. The letter reached Charleston 10 days later.
Beatrice Hargrove, a widow herself, and a woman of considerable social standing, was horrified by what she read. She immediately wrote to Dr. Thornton, asking him to visit Oak Ridge and assess Amelia's mental state. She also wrote to the county probate judge, expressing concern for her niece's welfare and her sister-in-law's fitness to manage the Sinclair estate. These letters, arriving almost simultaneously with the legal maneuverings Lawrence Caldwell was orchestrating, created a convergence of pressure on Amelia. By late August, multiple parties were moving against her, though she was not yet aware of the full extent of the conspiracy. Dr. Thornton visited Oak Ridge on August 20th, ostensibly to check on the family's health. He examined all 5 children and found them reasonably healthy, though young Henry showed signs of nervous strain. When the doctor asked to examine Jonas Blackwood and Levi Stanton, whose deteriorating conditions had been reported to him, Amelia initially refused. She insisted the men were suffering from ordinary summer fevers and that she was treating them appropriately. Dr. Thornton pressed the issue, and Amelia finally relented. She led him to the cabin where Jonas lay in a filthy cot, barely conscious. The doctor's examination revealed extreme emaciation, signs of heavy metal poisoning, including blue-gray discoloration of the gums and fingernails, neurological damage, evidenced by tremors and lack of coordination, and what appeared to be chemical burns on the man's shoulders and chest. Dr. Thornton was shocked. These were not symptoms of any natural fever. He insisted on examining Levi as well, and found similar signs of poisoning and abuse. He confronted Amelia directly, asking what treatment she had been administering. Amelia, her composure finally cracking, told him about the European physician's protocol, about the therapeutic bathing, about the tinctures and preparations designed to cure her own declining health. Dr. Thornton listened with growing alarm. He recognized some of the chemicals Amelia described as extremely toxic: mercury, arsenic, digitalis, in concentrations far beyond therapeutic doses. He told Amelia bluntly that she was not curing herself. She was murdering the 2 men. He said he would be reporting his findings to the county authorities and that she needed to stop the treatments immediately. Amelia's response was chilling in its calm rationality. She told Dr. Thornton that he had no authority over what she did with her own property.
The 3 men had been selected for a specific purpose, a purpose the doctor could not possibly understand. They had violated her in ways that transcended physical assault. They had participated, knowingly or not, in her husband's scheme to humiliate and degrade. They deserved what was happening to them. And besides, the treatments were working. She felt stronger, younger, more vital than she had in years. The transfer was real. Dr. Thornton left Oak Ridge deeply disturbed. He wrote directly to Milford and filed a formal report with both the county sheriff and the probate court. His testimony, combined with the documents Elias Moreau had provided to Lawrence Caldwell, created an overwhelming case against Amelia. On September 3rd, 1838, Sheriff Benjamin Talmadge arrived at Oak Ridge with a court order. Amelia Hargrove was to submit to examination by a panel of physicians to determine her mental competence. Pending the results of this examination, a temporary guardian would be appointed to manage the plantation and supervise her children. Amelia was not under arrest, but she was effectively stripped of all authority. The examination took place 3 days later at the courthouse in Milford. 3 physicians, including Dr. Thornton, questioned Amelia for over 4 hours. They asked about her beliefs regarding her husband's alleged conspiracy, her understanding of medical science, her reasoning behind the treatments she had administered. They examined her physically and mentally, looking for signs of hysteria, mania, or delusional thinking. Amelia
realizing that everything she had worked toward was collapsing, tried to present herself as rational and composed. But when the physicians pressed her on specific details, her underlying obsession became impossible to hide. She insisted that her theory about Edward's deception was based on careful observation and logic. She defended Langford's protocols as scientifically sound. She argued that the improvement in her own health proved the treatments were effective. She showed no remorse for Elijah's death or concern for the suffering of Jonas and Levi. The panel's conclusion was unanimous. Amelia Hargrove was suffering from severe delusional disorder and was mentally incompetent to manage her affairs or care for her children. They appointed Eliza's aunt, Beatrice Hargrove, from Charleston, as temporary guardian of the Sinclair children and estate. Beatrice arrived at Oak Ridge in mid-September with her own household staff and immediately took control. She moved Amelia to a locked bedroom in the main house, essentially making her a prisoner in her own home. She ordered the dawn rituals at Beaver Creek stopped permanently. She arranged for proper medical care for Jonas and Levi, though Dr. Thornton warned that the damage done to their bodies was likely irreversible. Amelia accepted her confinement with eerie calm. She had lost. She understood that, but she did not believe she had been wrong. In her mind, the conspiracy against her had simply been more powerful than her ability to resist it. Edward had won, even from the grave, by ensuring that people would think her mad rather than believe the truth of what he had done to her. Beatrice Hargrove began the process of investigating what had actually happened at Oak Ridge. She hired investigators to track down Theodore Langford in Charleston. They found his offices abandoned, his landlord reporting that he had left the city suddenly in early September, owing several months' rent. His personal effects had been removed, but investigators found hidden documents that revealed the full scope of his fraudulent medical practice and his correspondence with Amelia. More disturbing was the discovery of letters between Langford and Lawrence Caldwell, the attorney who had worked with Elias Moreau. These letters revealed that Caldwell had been Langford's other client, the third party who had been paying for reports on Amelia's activities. Caldwell had been deliberately allowing the situation at Oak Ridge to deteriorate, waiting for Amelia to commit acts so heinous that her removal would be legally unquestionable.
He had been planning to have himself appointed as guardian of the estate, which would have given him control of Oak Ridge's substantial assets. The conspiracy unraveled when Beatrice presented this evidence to the probate court. Caldwell was disbarred and fled Talbot County before he could be prosecuted. Elias Moreau, who had been an unwitting pawn in Caldwell's scheme, provided testimony about everything he had observed. The court acknowledged that while Amelia had indeed committed terrible acts, she had also been manipulated by Langford and allowed to spiral into madness by men who saw profit in her destruction. The question remained: what had Edward Sinclair actually done? Had he truly orchestrated the complex deception Amelia believed, or had her theory been pure delusion from the start? Beatrice Hargrove commissioned a private investigation, hiring a former Charleston police detective to examine the question. The detective spent weeks reviewing Oak Ridge's records, interviewing elderly servants, and tracing the histories of Elijah, Jonas, and Levi. What he discovered was both more complicated and more tragic than anyone had imagined. Edward Sinclair had indeed suffered from mumps in his 20s, an illness that often caused sterility in adult men. Medical records from his first marriage showed that his first wife had never conceived during 8 years of marriage, unusual for a couple with no apparent fertility issue on the wife's side. But Edward had not drugged Amelia or arranged for enslaved men to impregnate her against her will. Instead, he had done something far more calculating and cruel. He had deliberately fathered children with enslaved women before his marriage to Amelia. Children he kept at Oak Ridge and raised as valuable, skilled workers. When Amelia failed to conceive during the first 2 years of their marriage, Edward had begun a campaign of psychological manipulation, suggesting that perhaps the problem was with her, that perhaps she was barren, that perhaps God was punishing her for some sin. Then, when Amelia did conceive, after Edward had started giving her fertility tonics that were actually just harmless herbs, he encouraged her to believe the children were miracles, proof of divine intervention. But Amelia, perceptive and intelligent, had noticed the physical resemblances between her children and certain enslaved workers. She had drawn conclusions that were partially correct. Her children did share bloodlines with Elijah, Jonas, and Levi, but not because those men had been brought to her bed, because those 3 men were Edward's children, her children's half-brothers, making her own offspring products of Edward's earlier relationships with enslaved women. Edward had kept his mixed-race children at Oak Ridge, given them elevated positions, taught them skills, and even provided small privileges, all while maintaining the fiction that they were simply talented workers. He had created a complex web of secrets and lies, never intending for Amelia to learn the truth. He had assumed his secrets would die with him, but Amelia, through years of observation and suspicion, had pieced together a version of the truth that was close enough to reality to drive her to madness. She had been correct that her children shared blood with the 3 men. She had been correct that Edward had deceived her about the fundamental nature of their family. But she had constructed the mechanism of that deception in a way that transformed her from victim into perpetrator, from wronged wife into murderer. Jonas Blackwood died on September 24, 1838. His body finally succumbing to the accumulated poison Amelia had administered over 6 months. Levi Stanton survived, but remained in a state of permanent cognitive impairment, unable to work or care for himself. He lived another 8 years at Oak Ridge, cared for by other enslaved workers, a living ghost of what he had been. Amelia Hargrave was never prosecuted for murder. Under Alabama law in 1838, the killing of enslaved people by their owners was not legally considered murder, though it could be prosecuted as malicious destruction of property. Beatrice Hargrave, horrified by the entire situation and wanting to protect the Sinclair children from further scandal, arranged for the matter to be handled quietly. In November 1838, Amelia was committed to the Alabama State Asylum in Tuscaloosa. She lived there for 14 years, dying of pneumonia in 1852 at age 57. Hospital records describe her as a quiet patient who spent her days writing in journals that the staff regularly confiscated and destroyed. She never recounted her beliefs about Edward's conspiracy, never expressed remorse for the men she had killed, never acknowledged that she had been manipulated by Theodore Langford.
The Sinclair children were raised by their Aunt Beatrice Charles. Eliza married a physician from Philadelphia in 1842 and never returned to Alabama. William attended university in Virginia and eventually sold Oak Ridge in 1856. Wanting nothing to do with the plantation where such horror occurred. The younger children, Sophia, Henry, and Charlotte, were told edited versions of what had happened, stories that omitted the worst details of their mother's crime. Theodore Langford was never found. Some reports placed him in New Orleans in the early 1840s, still practicing his fraudulent medicine under a different name. Others claimed he had fled to Mexico or South America. He left behind dozens of victims across the American South, people he had exploited
with false promises of rejuvenation and vitality transfer. By 1850, his name had disappeared from all medical directories and city records, as if he had never existed at all. The truth about Edward Sinclair's secret children was never made public during the lifetime of anyone involved. The children he had fathered with enslaved women, except for the 3 Amelia had murdered, were sold away from Oak Ridge after Beatrice Hargrove took control of the estate. Their descendants, scattered across Alabama and beyond, never knew their connection to the prominent Sinclair family. Oak Ridge Plantation continued to operate under various owners until the Civil War. The main house was burned by Sherman's troops in 1864 during the March to the Sea. After the war, the property was subdivided and sold to former Confederate soldiers trying to rebuild their lives. By 1880, the original plantation had been broken into 6 separate farms, and the name Oak Ridge was largely forgotten, except by the oldest residents of Talbot County. Beaver Creek still flows through what was once the Sinclair property, clear and cold, but the banks where Amelia conducted her rituals became overgrown and avoided by local people. In the 1870s and 1880s, freedmen living in the area refused to fish or wash clothes in that particular bend of the creek. They told their children that the water there was cursed, that it had tasted blood and would never run clean again. By the 1890s, even white farmers avoided the spot, though they could not say exactly why, except that it felt wrong, that the air seemed heavier there, that birds did not sing in the cypress trees along that stretch of water. In 1891, a farmer plowing land that had once been part of Oak Ridge's fields unearthed a wooden box buried about 3 feet deep. Inside were glass bottles with residue, strange chemical, rusted medical instruments, and water-damaged papers covered in handwriting that had faded to illegibility. The farmer, unsettled by the discovery, reburied the box and never spoke of it to anyone except his wife. When he died in 1903, she burned his diary, which contained a description of the find, saying only that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The most chilling remnant of the Amelia Hargrove case surfaced in 1899 when a Charleston attorney named James Whitaker was settling the estate of an elderly widow named Beatrice Hargrove, who had died at age 94. Among her personal effects, carefully preserved in a locked trunk, was a collection of letters and documents related to her sister-in-law's crimes at Oak Ridge 60 years earlier. One letter in particular stood out, written by Amelia to Eliza in 1846 from the asylum in Tuscaloosa. Whitaker read the letter only once before deciding it should never be made public.
He described its contents years later to a colleague, saying, "The woman wrote with such clarity about her own madness, such understanding of what she had done and why, that reading her words was like looking into an abyss. She knew she had murdered innocent men. She knew the physician who advised her was a fraud. She knew her theory about her husband's conspiracy was built on fragments of truth, twisted by paranoia into something monstrous. But even knowing all of this, even after years of confinement and reflection, I could not say she would have acted differently. That was the most disturbing thing. Not that she was mad, but that she understood her madness and embraced it anyway." Whitaker burned Amelia's letter, along with most of the other documents from Beatrice Hargrove's trunk. He kept only a few items: receipts from the asylum showing payments for Amelia's care, a brief account Eliza had written in 1840 describing her mother's final lucid conversation before being committed, and a single page from one of Amelia's journals dated March 10th, 1838, 1 week after Edward's death and 3 days into the Creek rituals. The journal entry, which Whitaker preserved because he believed it was historically significant despite being deeply disturbing, read,
"I have begun the treatments Dr. H prescribed." The 3 subjects responded as expected to the initial procedures. I felt nothing during the first session, no sensation of renewal, but today, the 3rd day, I felt something. Perhaps it was only the cold water shocking my body to wakefulness. Perhaps it was the satisfaction of finally taking action after years of helpless rage. Or perhaps the treatments do work, and what I felt was the beginning of the restoration Dr. H promised. I cannot yet be certain, but I know this: I will continue. I have gone too far to stop now. Even if doubt whispers that I am simply murdering 3 men to feed a delusion, the doubt itself must be crushed. Faith in the treatment is part of the treatment. I must believe. This single page remained in the Whitaker family archives until 1947, when the attorney's grandson donated it to the Alabama Historical Society, along with a brief explanatory note. The society cataloged it, but did not display it or make it available to researchers, judging the content too disturbing and the provenance too questionable. It remains in their restricted collection to this day, available only to scholars who can demonstrate legitimate academic purpose. In Talbot County, the story of Amelia Hargrove and the rituals at Beaver Creek became a cautionary tale whispered among the elderly, a story about the dangers of grief and obsession, about the evil that could flourish in a society built on slavery and absolute power. But with each retelling, details were altered or forgotten. By the 1920s, most people who heard the story assumed it was pure legend, a ghost story invented to frighten children away from dangerous water. The last person who remembered the events firsthand was a woman named Sarah Hawthorne, born in 1835, who had been Elijah Hawthorne's niece. She lived to the remarkable age of 106, dying in 1941. In her final years, living with her great-granddaughter in Montgomery, she would sometimes speak of her uncle Elijah, the carpenter who had been murdered by the mistress at Oak Ridge. She described him as a kind man, talented and intelligent, who'd been given no choice but to obey when called to the creek each morning. She said that toward the end, he had told her that dying was not the worst. The worst part was forgetting who he was while still being alive, feeling himself disappear piece by piece while his body continued to function. Sarah wept when she spoke of this even 70 years after his death, saying that some cruelties were so profound they echoed across generations. When Sarah Hawthorne died in 1941, the last living link to the Oak Ridge horror died with her. The few documents that survived, scattered across family archives and historical society collections, were too fragmentary to tell the complete story. Future generations would know that something terrible had happened at a plantation in Talbot County in 1838, that a woman named Amelia Hargrove had been committed to an asylum for unspecified crimes against enslaved workers, that 3 men had died under mysterious circumstances. But the full scope of the horror, the psychological complexity of the crime, the web of deception and fraud that had enabled it, all of this was lost to time. What remains is Beaver Creek, still flowing through Talbot County, its waters still cold and clear. The bend where Amelia conducted her rituals is unmarked and unremarkable, indistinguishable from 1,000 other places along 1,000 other southern creeks. But the water remembers, the land remembers, and in the memories of descendants who still live in Alabama, scattered fragments of the story persist, distorted by time, but never quite disappearing, like bloodstains that no amount of scrubbing can fully erase. This mystery shows us how easily desperation and betrayal can transform a person into something unrecognizable, how the systems of power and oppression in the Old South created conditions where such horrors could occur with minimal legal consequence. It reveals the darkest aspects of a society built on slavery, where human beings could be tortured and killed with almost no accountability, where women's rage and trauma could find expression only in violence against those even more powerless than themselves, where medical charlatans preyed on the desperate and vulnerable, and where family secrets could poison multiple generations. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Amelia was a victim driven to madness, or a murderer who used her circumstances as justification? Could anyone have stopped what happened at Beaver Creek before it was too late? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.